welcome to part 2 of chapter 15. I've assigned this video as homework for you to watch before your test on Monday. So I just want to start out with a brief review and kind of synthesize where we're at and where we're going. So in chapter 12, which was the first week of class, we talked about the classification of life overall. We talked about the different phylum of animals and the divisions of the marine environment. So we talked about epipelagic, mesopelagic, bathypelagic, and abyssopelagic. We also talked about neuretic and oceanic. And then we also kind of mentioned the classification of animals based on their mobility. And so we talked about animals as being planktonic, and then we divided that into phytoplankton and zooplankton. We talked about animals as being benthic, living on or in the sediment. And then we talked about animals as being nekton, swimming animals, right? In chapter 13, we focused on primary productivity because it's the base of habitats. Of all habitats, it's the bottom of the food chain. And so we talked about where primary productivity is its highest, where it's low, and so we talked about it being right off the coasts of the continents in shallow waters, in part because of runoff from the continents, but also in part because of upwelling. We talked about bad primary productivity, the harmful algal blooms. Those are caused by dinoflagellates, and they cause things like red tide and decreased oxygen levels in the water. Those can be a bad thing. After we talked about these two things, kind of the base of the food chain, we moved on up to talk about fisheries and threats to fisheries, as well as the euphotic zone, kind of animals that live in that upper layer of water contained within the epipelagic that is full of light. It's where all light happens, and so it's where our most diverse communities form. In chapter 14, we talked about adaptations of pelagic animals. So pelagic animals describes both nekton and plankton. These are things that live in the water column. And so we talked about their adaptations for buoyancy, adaptations for avoiding prey, or attracting prey. For nekton, we talked about both the euphotic zone, so animals that live in the light, or that top layer of water, so that's anything in a coral reef, anything in a grass bed, anything in an estuary. But we also talked about the animals that live in complete darkness, the mesopelagic. They're part of that deep scattering layer. And so the animals that live in the mesopelagic have a lot different adaptations than nekton living in the euphotic zone. They're oftentimes red in color, they've got big eyes, upward hinged jaws, and instead of counter shading, they've got counter luminescence, and so they've got photophores and bioluminescence on the bottom of their bodies, and they've got just very, very different animals. We also talked about adaptations of phytoplankton and zooplankton in terms of their buoyancy and avoiding predation. And we kind of actually circled back to a little bit of chapter 12, where we talked about cold water versus warm water adaptations for phytoplankton and zooplankton. Right. And then moving on from pelagic animals, we are talking about in chapter 15 all the benthic communities. Oh, there should be a space there. Benthic communities. So in class, we talked about the near-shore benthic communities. Those are things that occur on rocky intertidal beaches, sandy intertidal beaches, or estuaries and mudflats. And so things like mangroves, mudflats, salt marshes, places where fresh water comes in. We talked about the shallow communities and the adaptations that animals need to live in the benthos there. Typically on those rocky beaches, you have epibenthos. On sandy beaches, you have infauna. And in mudflats, you have animals that are highly mobile and halo-tolerant. They can adapt to high variations in the salinity of the water. A lot of those estuaries are also really good nursery grounds because the water is pretty calm. It's rich in nutrients. It's just a really great place, a safe place for things to grow up. This lecture is going to focus on offshore benthic habitats, and so things that aren't covered and uncovered by water, things that are always covered. They occur in a little bit deeper water, and so and here's a little graphic of our review. We started with all marine life. We talked about how to classify it, both in terms of taxonomy, the phyla, as well as physical characteristics. We talked about classifying by mobility, classifying on divisions of the marine environment, habitats and adaptations. So our thought process has kind of gone in this direction. We're still talking about living things in the marine environment, and then mobility. We also talked about adaptations like fins related to mobility as well, and adaptations related to habitats. Within adaptations, there were structural adaptations, which is like physical, and then there were behavioral adaptations, which is how that animal acts. All right, so chapter 15, again, we've talked about all of these things. We've talked about nearshore benthic habitats in class. This lecture is going to focus on offshore environments, and specifically, we're going to talk about these few questions. So, what fauna and adaptations occur in shallow ocean floors? So we'll talk about first shallow ocean habitats, benthic habitats, and in that we'll talk about kelp beds, we'll talk about coral reefs, and then we're going to go farther offshore and we're going to talk about deep ocean floor habitats, and that's going to be our hydrothermal vent communities, cold seeps and hydrocarbon seeps. And so this lecture, you can kind of think of it as being divided into neritic benthic habitats and oceanic benthic habitats. And so in the neritic zone, we see like coral reefs and kelp beds. In the oceanic stuff, we see hydrothermal vents, cold seeps, and hydrocarbon seeps. And we're just going to talk briefly about each of those communities and the kinds of animals and critters that we see there. All right. So I'm going to start off with kelp forests. Kelp forests are a plant, and kelp forests can be really, really huge. Because they're a plant, they actually need a kind of a hard substrate to dig into, and so we only really see kelp forests on rocky bottoms. They also like cold water, and so because they're a plant, they're going to need nutrients. What we see is that kelp forests kind of occur in upwelling zones. Upwelling not only brings the nutrients that kelp forests need, but they also bring deep cold waters, and so that satisfies both. And then for geologic reasons that we'll talk about later, west coasts tend to be rockier. Kelp forests support a great deal of primary productivity. They're these huge plants that can grow up to like 50 meters long, and they provide great hiding places. It's almost like a forest that you see on land. There's these huge, huge plants that kind of grow pretty close together, and it's a nice shady environment with lots of places to hide. There aren't a whole lot of organisms that feed directly on the kelp, but lots and lots of organisms use it for protection. And so in kelp forests, we see a lot of seals, we see a lot of echinoderms, there's plenty of turtles, lots of sharks because there's plenty of fish in there as well. And then when we were talking about marine mammals, we talked about order Carnivora. So you see those seals and you see the sea otters a lot in kelp beds. Good protection in those habitats. Again, we see kelp forests kind of on the western coasts of continents. That has to do with the cold water that's being brought up into those areas, as well as the nutrients from those upwelling currents on the west coasts. Okay. Coral reefs are a little bit different. Coral reefs, and I'm going to make some notes up here, they like warm water. And so we only see them in warm water habitats. They also like low nutrient water. So where we see kelp forests happening on the west coast because they like cold water and high nutrients, we see coral reefs kind of forming in the opposite conditions. And so we think warm water, low nutrients, warm water, low nutrients, warm water, low nutrients, warm water, low nutrients, lots of warm water and very low nutrients. So these tend to occur on the eastern coasts, calm waters, low nutrient waters. They only form in the tropical regions of the world, and that's pretty important. And they form on rocky bottoms as well. So coral, again, needs something hard to attach onto, on top of warm water and low nutrients. And so we usually find these in very clear waters. In Florida, they're growing on top of old reefs. As long as there's something hard for those corals to attach to, they can start to build reefs. They're formed by millions of coral polyps, and you can imagine a coral polyp as being like this miniature jellyfish, right? They're in the phylum Cnidaria, and so these coral polyps grow in these communities together, and many polyps make up a coral, and they're actually really interesting. They've got a shared gut, and so all of these polyps are actually connected. They have their little tentacles that catch plankton coming in, and they've got this shared gut layer in a coral. And so if I hurt one polyp, I kind of hurt the whole coral, and that could be a big problem. This is why we don't want to touch corals. So anyways, corals are formed by millions of coral polyps living in benthic colonies. And so just like fish school, corals are kind of these colonial animals that live together. They're constructed of calcium carbonate, and I'm going to bring in some coral skeletons so you can see that. In the IMAX movie, I asked you the question, what is calcium carbonate? It is CaCO2. It's a formation of a product as the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. They mix with calcium in the water and form this calcium carbonate. Other things that use calcium carbonate are mollusks, USCS, so like squid and nautilus for their enclosed gas chambers. Those are actually made out of calcium carbonate, as well as shells are made out of calcium carbonate. So any kind of bivalve like a clam or a gastropod like a snail is also made out of calcium carbonate. So mollusks and coral use this chemical to build their skeletons, and it's a lot like the calcium that we use to make our bones. Same kind of idea. Many corals rely on a mutualistic, both animals benefit relationship with an algae, and so we say that they have a symbiotic algae, and the name for that algae is zooanthellae. I want you to know this word. Zooanthellae is the symbiotic algae that occurs with corals. Much like our sea slugs in the classroom, these algae are able to do photosynthesis, and so they've got little algae within them that have chloroplasts. And so while the Cnidaria part of a coral is catching food out of the water, right, or suspension feeding, the zooanthellae is actually doing photosynthesis, and so they kind of feed each other. The reason that coral reefs need low nutrient waters and clear waters, clear so that their zooanthellae can get sunlight, right? If there's a bunch of sediments, the corals are going to clog up and the zooanthellae won't get sunlight. The whole thing will die and starve to death because neither can get food. Corals, though, are kind of a funny symbiosis. They need low nutrient waters because if they have high nutrient waters, their zooanthellae actually take over. And so their algae become really overproductive, and that can be a bad thing for the coral polyps. And so if nutrients get too high or sunlight is too much and the zooanthellae start to take over, corals will actually expel their zooanthellae. They'll push them out, they'll kick them out, and at that point that is called coral bleaching. So they actually kind of lose their color once they expel their algae, and they only do that when they're really stressed. And so again, warm waters, low nutrient waters, and clear waters, so their zooanthellae can help them make food. All right. They need light and low turbidity. Specifically, as far as warm goes, corals like 64 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty big range because there's lots of kinds of corals. A general coral species, though, has about a plus or minus 5 degrees that they like to live in. They need zooanthellae to help them with food, and low turbidity, low nutrient waters, again, so those zooanthellae don't take over. Okay. Coral reefs are incredibly important, so just like kelp forests have a lot of productivity, so do coral reefs, and coral reefs are really interesting and charismatic because they hold 25% of all marine species. That's benthic, that's nectonic, that's planktonic. However, this is really fascinating because they only cover 0.05% of the ocean. So coral reefs are extremely limited, but they support this huge biodiversity. They're also economically beneficial to the places where they occur. So because of this, because they're so rare and they've got so much, people pay big bucks to come see coral reefs. That's really great for local economies in equatorial countries. In the United States, our only really kind of touristy coral reef on the continental U.S. is in Florida. We'll be going there. But Hawaii has some too, right? Hawaii falls in this region as well. For a lot of equatorial countries, these are third world countries though, unlike the U.S., and so there's huge economic benefits, not only in terms of fishing, but in terms of tourism on these coral reefs. They're good for the environment overall because they have a really big capacity to take CO2, this greenhouse gas, out of the air and in its place make oxygen. So coral reefs are important to support and kind of preserve because they have huge biodiversity. They are good for global climate change, and they've got economic benefits for the places where they occur. Right? All good things, we can pretty much agree. This is an idea of where reef building happens. So we get them in these tropical and subtropical latitudes between the Tropic of Capricorn and then up here it's not labeled, but the Tropic of Cancer. Between those latitudes we get coral reefs. And the colors down here represent number of, kind of like you could think of that as diversity of coral. And so the South Pacific and Indonesian and Pacific Island reefs are some of the most diverse in the world. Over here, the reefs that we're going to see have some diversity. We fall about there, right? And then in turn, Hawaii is falling about here. So whenever you see like the IMAX documentary, I told you that was all filmed in the Pacific Islands. Hugely true. The other really important reef is the Great Barrier Reef right here along Australia. That is the longest reef sequence in the world. And you can see that it segues right up into here, into those shallow waters. Okay? All right. I'm not going to worry about coral reef zonation. You don't have to know that. I do want to tell you briefly about cold water corals, though. So the picture I just showed you is of all these warm water corals. And we know about warm water corals because they're easy to see. They happen in really shallow waters and really warm waters, and we can see them pretty easily. We've known about warm water corals for a really long time. Cold water corals are these blue dots on here, and you can see that these occur outside of the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. They're in these really cold waters and also kind of turbid waters. So cold water corals were initially discovered in 1982. And they're only discovered in 1982 because that's when we started getting the technology to go deep in the ocean. These actually live below the euphotic zone. So they live in the dark, and they live in extremely nutrient-rich waters. And because of this, they lack zooxanthellae. They don't have that symbiotic algae. Compared to warm water species, these things grow very slowly, but we found out as we go down to these cold water reefs that they've got similar biodiversity to the warm water reefs, which is really impressive. I've told you before that the deep sea is the most unexplored place. It's the place where most of the new discoveries of new species are going to come out of, and we're finding more and more of these deep sea communities that have kind of a source of habitat down there. And so there's these cold water corals communities where we're discovering great biodiversity. Right? And these are kind of the opposite of warm water corals. There are a lot of threats to coral reefs, though, and this is important because if there's a threat to coral reefs, then we know that there's also a threat to biodiversity, there's a threat to economic benefits, and there's a threat because of global climate change. If we don't have this to kind of mitigate or counteract climate change, that could be a really bad thing. Ocean acidification is a result of CO2 absorption in the water. Excess carbon dioxide actually changes the pH of the water, and what this does is it affects the CaCO2. It affects the calcium carbonate shells. And so if you've ever seen vinegar poured on baking soda, you can kind of think of that as the same thing. Those animals that depend on calcium carbonate, like coral reefs, like mollusks, if the ocean becomes too acidic, then they are either unable to make their shells, or their shells become weakened and kind of dissolve due to that acidity. That's a really big deal. If we lose the reefs, then we lose everything that goes along with it. And so this ocean acidification is kind of one of the main concerns. Another main concern is with global climate change, we also get sea surface temperature rising. As sea surface temperatures rise, those corals get really stressed. And when those corals get really stressed, they will bleach, they'll expel their algae, and they may not survive. Coral, again, have about a plus or minus 5-degree temperature range that they like to be. Later in the semester, we'll do a coral bleaching lab and we'll look at sea surface temperatures. But for now, just know that if temperatures rise too much or drop too much in an area, those corals get really stressed out and their lives are at risk. Many species of reef-building corals are already at risk of extinction. This is either because of human populations treating them incorrectly. A lot of tourist places, especially in third world countries, don't monitor tourists touching the corals or standing on the corals, and once you touch a coral, it dies. That's it. And so they're these extremely fragile creatures that, because of human activities, are at risk. Benthic trawling is another major one. Trawling. And then overfishing on the reefs is a concern as well. Any kind of human traffic is usually pretty dangerous for a reef. Continental runoff, as we use more and more fertilizers, those waters are getting more and more nutrients, and those zooanthellae are taking over corals, so they'll have to expel them. And then last but not least, I do kind of want to talk about this extinction and human factor. In a lot of beach communities or island communities, you find like these shell stores or coral stores where you can buy different corals and shark's teeth and shells and things like that. Know that some of those stores can be extremely bad for coral reefs. Depending on where you're at and their harvesting practices, there are still places that'll take dynamite out to a reef, blow it up, and collect the shells and the coral, and then take it to that store to be sold. So if you're ever buying shells or buying coral, please ask about how those things were harvested. If they're going in and taking abandoned shells, that's not a big issue. But if reefs are being destroyed for consumer purposes, that could be a big problem. So know that that still exists. All right, so I'm going to move from nearshore to offshore communities. There are 3 major communities. There are hydrothermal vents, there are cold seeps, and there are hydrocarbon seeps. This word hydro means water, thermal means temperature. A hydrothermal vent is hot water that's coming out extremely deep in the ocean. So you can think of these things as kind of underwater volcanoes, but with water. With this really hot water at extreme depths, there are a lot of dissolved minerals that kind of come shooting out of these vents. And this is really great for a lot of benthic creatures. I'll talk about them in a second. Cold seeps are kind of the opposite. And so a cold seep is where this extremely cold, super saline, so hypersaline or very high salinity water seeps out. And when hypersaline cold water seeps out, it has hydrogen sulfide, which occurs randomly in limestone fractures, but this kind of seeps out, and this is the nutrients for that community. Right, and so we'll talk about cold seeps as well. And then last but not least, hydrocarbon seeps are oil, right? So oil and gas, like crude oil and natural gas, the things that we're harvesting here in the Rocky Mountains are also present in, particularly for us, the U.S., the Gulf of Mexico. these things seep out naturally. It's totally normal for oil to be in the ocean. But in a natural habitat, these do these at an extremely slow rate. And so there are mechanisms in place to process that oil, but too much oil, like the BP oil spill, can be a real problem for those communities. Hydrocarbon seeps are naturally rich in nutrients, and there's communities that thrive off of actually eating the oil as kind of the food source. So we'll talk about those as well. All right, deep sea communities. Deep sea communities happen along these plate boundaries in the world. And we haven't talked about geology yet, but no, this is where tectonic plates, or like crusts of the earth, meet. And so there's a lot of geologic activity in these areas. And so we also see deep sea communities forming in those areas because of the shifting earth. Deep sea communities thrive not on photosynthesis, but on chemosynthesis. So photosynthesis involves light. Chemosynthesis involves chemicals and usually sulfur. PHUR. So sulfur and sulfide chemicals, as well as hydrocarbons. This is a different form of primary productivity. And so this is where animals are able to take chemicals instead of light and generate their own food, just like plants generate their own food with photosynthesis. So in these deep sea communities down in the bathypelagic and abyssopelagic, there is no light. These communities rely on the process of chemosynthesis, which again is like photosynthesis. We see a huge diversity of these kinds of animals down there. So clams, crabs, sea stars, shrimp, tube worms, which I'm going to talk about. These are really interesting. And even some fish down there. And so these tube worms often have a symbiotic bacteria, and the bacteria are usually what do chemosynthesis at those deep sea communities. And so here we've got a picture of a deep sea community. This is of a cold seep. And so down at this cold seep, you can see we've got some anemones here. We've got lots and lots of snails as well. More anemones, and even some crabs down here. A lot of these animals do have, again, symbiotic bacteria that do chemosynthesis. Right? This is a picture of tube worms, and these tube worms are a type of annelid, N-N-E-L-I-D, that have a bacteria in their gut, almost like our sea slugs have algae, symbiotic algae. These have symbiotic bacteria that do chemosynthesis. Tube worms are a characteristic of hydrothermal vent communities, and so as those minerals are dissolving out, these guys kind of take in those minerals and chemicals, and their bacteria are able to produce food. There's lots of things that live in and around these, just like in a mangrove community, things live in and around the roots, and plenty of things that eat tube worm plumes, right, as well as other animals there. You can even see like a little crab here, and there's a bivalve and some mollusks, more mollusks down here, and then all tube worms. Tube worms, the red part is kind of like a gill of sorts. It's kind of the same thing that you see on feather duster worms. These worms have a tube that they create that they're able to live in and kind of retract down into. Vent tube worms, so tube worms that occur at hydrothermal vents, can grow up to 1 meter a year, and they can grow up to 15 meters long. And so these are enormous things. So when you see this, you have a little bit of scale that, you know, if this is a crab, then these are fairly short tube worms. They're probably 6 to 10 feet, somewhere in there. But tube worms can get really huge. Cold seep tube worms, so these animals that occur at the cold version of hydrothermal vents, these grow extremely slowly, and look at the time span on this, right? 175 to 250 years to grow. So these deep sea communities are also extremely old communities. And when we talked about phytoplankton and kind of adaptations of warm water and cold water, we talked about cold water things having a longer lifespan. And this is a great example of that, right? We've got these worms deep down that are living for over 100 years, but they grow very slowly. Also a characteristic of cold water. I want to talk about this picture for a second. And so this picture is actually of hydrothermal vent tube worms. These are the fast-growing ones, right? Up to 1 meter a year, which is like 3.5 feet in 1 year. When we first discovered these things in the 80s, we didn't know much about them, and so we see these huge tube worms down there. We have no idea how fast they grow. And so what scientists did is they went down and dyed the tubes blue with a copper solution, and then they came back a year later, and the worms had made new tube that wasn't dyed, and so they can actually get the growth rate off of that. We did the same thing for cold seep tube worms once we found those. Needless to say, they're only growing, a couple centimeters a year, and so cold seep tube worms have a much slower growth rate. We don't see a whole lot of addition based on when we've dyed them. Right? This is an example of a cold seep, and so cold seeps are also called underwater lakes. This is not a great picture, but you can see the sub here, right? And this is a place where this super saline, super dense water is kind of leaking out of the crust of the earth. And you can see this little pool here deep down. This is super dense water that also has nutrients. And then all of these little dots out here are mollusks. And so these mollusks, as this water kind of flows out, they're grabbing onto those nutrients that are in that super saline water and then transferring them to that symbiotic bacteria that does chemosynthesis. Cold seeps are common in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're a fairly new discovery for us. So we've discovered them within the last decade or so, and we're continually learning more about these deep sea communities. This is another example of a deep sea community. These are cold seep tube worms, and so you can see, right, in comparison to the submarine, they're similar in size, so we're looking at 2 to 3 meters, somewhere in there, but extremely old communities. And so these are the ones that, because they live deep down in cold water, they grow very slowly, and we're looking at 100+ years old for this tube worm community. A hydrocarbon seep is something I want to take a minute and talk about. A hydrocarbon seep is oil or natural gas, and again, we see a lot of these in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is extremely rich in oil resources, and this is where we get a lot of our U.S. oil from, and so there's plenty of drills and rigs and things out there, just like we have in Rangeley, but out on the ocean. There are also natural seeps in the Gulf of Mexico, just like if you walk around in Rangeley, you might see crude oil coming out of the ground. It's uncommon, but it does happen here. It's uncommon here because as soon as we see it coming out of the ground, they put a drill there. However, in the ocean, these are normal occurrences. These are extremely rich in chemicals, and every year, about 22 million gallons of crude oil seeps naturally into the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so these are just little bits of oil that are coming out slowly and in lots of different spots. Around these hydrocarbon seeps, we actually see a really strong bacterial community that are doing chemosynthesis. And so you can actually think about this as there's bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico that are fully equipped to digest and eat oil. And that's what they live on. And these are plankton, right? These are specifically bacteria plankton. And you know from us already talking about fisheries, where there's a high concentration of plankton, there's also a really good deep sea, or a good fish community and a good habitat. And so what we're finding is around these natural oil seeps, there's a huge diversity of animals there supported that we've never seen before. And this is because of natural oil going into the Gulf of Mexico. To give you an idea of man-made oil spills, right, I've given you the two biggest ones in U.S. history. The Exxon Valdez, which occurred in the late 80s or early 90s, was 11 million gallons that occurred up in Alaska. And then the BP oil spill that happened in 2010 was 184 million gallons. And so these are really detrimental for a few reasons. Whereas natural oil kind of slowly and dispersely seeps out in rates that these bacteria can consume, these oil spills are huge amounts in one place that go up to the top of the water. And at the top of the water, there's not these bacteria because that's not where oil naturally comes out. And so once oil gets up to the top of the water in these big quantities, you've got all these animals that aren't equipped to deal with it because that's not naturally how this works, right? The bacteria consume it at the bottom and it stays at the bottom. And so with these big oil spills, we see a lot of animals living in the epipelagic that are not equipped to deal with oil, and in turn it killed them. If you follow the BP oil spill, they use this stuff called dispersant, ANT, which is the stuff that would kind of grab onto the oil slick at the top and chunk it up into little bits. Those little bits would sink down to the benthic communities. And the idea behind this was that, okay, we chunk up the oil, we sink it down, and then there's all these little bacteria that can do chemosynthesis down there. Great idea, right? Because, well, then those bacteria can digest it, and this big thing is not a problem anymore. The problem with the dispersant did its job. It broke up the oil and it sunk down. The problem with the dispersant was that it was a poison. And so these animals in the benthic communities suddenly have this toxic substance all down in the water. And so what we see in the Gulf of Mexico is a huge impact on those benthic communities because of the use of dispersants. All the oil in the Gulf of Mexico from the BP oil spill is still there. Because not only did we sink it down into the sands, we killed a lot of the things that were supposed to process it naturally. And so even to this day in Alaska, over a decade later, you can dig down into the rocks and into the shore and find oil pockets. Even to this day in the Gulf of Mexico, and for years and decades to come, you will be able to dig your toes in the sand and hit oil as a result of this dispersant kind of sinking it down to the benthic communities. All right. This is what a hydrocarbon seep looks like, and so we've actually got these little annelids here, and the hydrocarbon seep. So again, they've got the symbiotic bacteria. Oops. These guys, a lot like cave organisms, lack pigment, and they have that red color again to blend in. But in this photo, we're shining a light on them. So symbiotic bacteria that do chemosynthesis at those hydrocarbon seeps, naturally processing that oil. What we see here as well is this kind of microscopic view of a little blob of oil and this bacteria going in to get a meal to do its chemosynthesis. And so naturally occurring in microscopic amounts, this is processable. Human impact with this in one single place and lots at one time, these little bacteria can't go fast enough, and the oil isn't in the right place for them to process it. And so there's a few problems with oil spills for that. All right, and that concludes chapter 15. I will see you in class on Monday.